Look, we've covered some pretty fascinating breeds on this channel, some big, some small, and each with its own set of positives and negatives, but the American Guinea Hog is a first for us. We've never come across an animal with so few negatives to its record. The feisty little guineas seem a little too good to be true, and if there weren't so many first-hand accounts, we wouldn't have believed it to be true. High-quality meat, lots of lard, virtually no health problems, and all of that just from being reared on grass alone. Who'd have thought we might have just found the unicorn of swines? Let's have a look at the American Guinea Hog. Their origins are a little murky. We know that they started making an appearance about 300 years ago, most likely by crossbreeding a mix of breeds that came from just about everywhere. The people on farms and small holdings in the South just weren't too fussed about where they got their pigs, as long as they had livestock to rear so that they could feed their families. And to them, one pig was just as good as another. There are mentions of the Appalachian English hog, Berkshire, the improved Essex, and even wild African boars that came with the slave ships. Either way, after a few generations of indiscriminate couplings, a new breed just sort of organically appeared, and they kept being swapped out and traded amongst the states in the South. This accidental breed is one of the first true homegrown American breeds to make an appearance in the history books, and just like its Appalachian and African roots, the Guinea was a hardy little thing, ideal to forage and care for itself with as little attendance from its keepers as possible. It just wasn't as finicky as its high-priced contenders, and since they were considered a bit of a bastard breed in the beginning, high society looked down at them and would never have allowed those tainted chops to soil their tables. But the joke was on them. The Guinea Hog's unique variation of lineages actually raised the quality of their meat and lard exponentially. The common folk were eating much more nutritious and, quite frankly, delicious pork than the gentlemen or ladies seated at the high tables. Luckily, outdated class rules fell out of fashion, and the Guinea Hog started to gain a little more standing by the 1800s. American pride in their own country hog, among all of the breeds that came from overseas, won out at the end of the day. You can always count on some good old-fashioned patriotism from the boys down south after all. They weren't really considered a big production animal, except on the homestead scene, and they became more of a national treasure than anything else. During the Second World War, when times were tough and production took an enormous hit, the guineas shined at their brightest. Their natural foraging capabilities just made them cheaper and more efficient to raise than the factory breeds. And they are the reason that small farms were able to keep afloat and the kids on those farms didn't starve to death. They kept the country going as much as the Victory Gardens did. Today, almost 2 million Americans have guinea hogs, but very few of those actually reach the pure standard that the breed requires. Given that the numbers for pure specimens are relatively low, they are technically considered a rare breed. But since they started their journey labeled as bastards anyway, we're sure that the American Guinea Hog cares about as much about our standards now as they did 300 years ago. Let's get into their characteristics first, and then move over to why they are so inexpensive and remarkably productive. Guineas are on the smaller size for pigs, clocking in at anywhere from 150 to 250 pounds for a mature pig. At a hanging weight, they can easily reach 100 pounds. At most, the boars will reach 300 pounds, but they'll stop growing after this point, no matter how many more months they have before they technically reach maturity. Their bones know exactly how much weight they can hold, and they won't go beyond that healthy amount, no matter which way you try to selectively breed them, unless you crossbreed with other breeds, in which case you won't have a guinea hog anymore. Don't get us wrong, purity isn't the biggest concern with these pigs. A little bit of crossbreeding in their distant pasts won't affect their meat, lard, or foraging capabilities, but actively trying to breed new qualities will just take away from their ability to feed themselves after a while. Very, very few pigs are completely reliant on forage like the American Guinea Hog is. Usually black, there is a lot of room for variation in them. A red tinge to their fur, white socks, and a spot here or there isn't all that uncommon. The wild African boars probably did have some input in their existence because these pigs were made for foraging. The medium snouts that they most likely got from Africa puts them right in the middle for foragers. They can dig for roots, but they'll eat whatever's growing topside first before moving on to what remains beneath the surface. This makes them the perfect pig for rotational grazing. They're a pretty chill animal compared to the other breeds, so much so that they don't mind sharing a grazing field with other livestock. Unless a sow is in heat and aggression is understandably higher, they shouldn't have any problems living with other species of livestock. In the field, they won't just eat the foliage, they'll even eat rodents and snakes. They are some of the most efficient and versatile swines to keep on a property. They can be penned, but they'll need a large area and a little extra food if you want to keep them happy. In other words, they'd prefer some grazing, and that is the healthiest option for them. But if you are unable to give them a patch of land, then it is perfectly doable to pen them. Just make sure they aren't crammed against each other too tightly, and that your sows have separate farrowing holdings when the time comes. The amount of lard that they deliver is what makes them so unusual. Most swines who rely so heavily on forage are on the leaner side, and they just can't supply more than a household with lard. But not the guineas. They bring just as much rich, clean fat as the commercial pigs do, and their lard is of a much better quality than the factory breeds could ever wish to have. Usually on this channel, we like to highlight the disadvantages as much as the pros. But honestly, there are so few disadvantages to the guineas that it's barely worth mentioning. For one, they grow slow. But that's to be expected with any heritage breed. Your guineas will be ready for slaughter in a year, 2 years if you want to grow them to the absolute highest weight that they can reach. Treat them like you would beef. They'll take to pasture, growing out slowly over a year or two before the time comes for them to go to slaughter. The only difference between your guineas and cattle is that the guineas need a home to go back to at night. They want their roof and the familiarity that comes with it, and they'll need some mud and water like any hog needs. But as far as food, care and space goes, the two really are very close to each other. If you're willing to take on a grazing cow, then a dozen guineas won't be a problem for you. Breeding for size, or any specific characteristic, just won't work unless you veer away from the breed completely. Their bodies know what their weight and size limits are, and they won't grow beyond that. And why would you even want to try? If you want a bigger pig, get a bigger breed. The guinea's value is tied to their manageable size after all. That brings us to the commercial side of the business. Their relaxed natures makes it possible to push a few more together on a patch of land than other heritage breeds. Make no mistake, they can't be crammed in like sardines, but they'll tolerate a little stress if you force it. Sows deliver an average of 6 to 8 piglets in a single farrowing, so you'll have a little trouble getting their numbers up, not to mention that they'll require a year before you can take them to slaughter. This time spent raising them will be more manual labor than a small holding can afford. At the end of the day, they are a small holding pig. There's no question about that, and there's no use trying to get them to be anything else. Forcing them to handle that kind of stress will just lead to aggression and all of their disease resistance to go out the window. They are some of the most docile breeds around. But make no mistake, a pig is still a pig. All that poundage storming at you to get at some food is going to get you hurt if you're not careful. When people hear docile, they automatically assume that they'll be lazy and affectionate and nothing more. But every animal, no matter how inclined it is to seek peace, can still get angry when it's baited, and it will get just as excited at feeding time or when one of the ladies is in heat as any other animal would. If you are new to keeping pigs, have a walk around a farm in your area that has hogs. Feed them, work with them, and get the experience on the ground yourself before making up your mind. At the end of the day, keeping them in the pasture is the absolute best way to go. If anything, giving them too much supplemental feed will cause problems because they'll gain an unhealthy amount of weight, leading to brittle bones and a sudden onslaught of health problems that they really shouldn't have. They can feed themselves just fine on the field, and your additional kitchen and garden scraps will make up for the rest. Unlike the other semi-pasture pigs, who need at least 20% of their feed supplemented in order to gain the appropriate amount of weight, guineas just don't need it to gain fat from fresh grazing. If you're low on grass, you'll have to supply them with hay, because that's where most of their calories come from. You'll be astounded that a grazing hog could produce that amount of lard just from grazing. Their digestive tracts are just made to leach every last ounce of nutrition out of what they eat. Those strong intestines also allow them a little more leeway when it comes to spoiled food. We're not saying that they should eat rotten food, not at all, but if a shred of meat does make it into your kitchen scrap bucket, don't sweat it too much. If it's not completely rancid, and they aren't having disproportionate amounts of meat, they'll handle it just fine. These babies eat snakes and rats after all. They're so good at clearing pests that people used to run them through their infested garden beds and barns instead of putting out poison to get rid of rats and reptiles. This adaptability translates into their environments too. If it's boiling hot, give them some mud and water to cool off in. If it's freezing, well, a lean-to with some dry bedding will do the job for them. Unless the conditions are Arctic-level cold or high desert heat, these piggies will be able to make do with what they have. They toe the line between the production value of commercial pigs and the hardiness and disease resistance of wild boars perfectly. Unless their surroundings are unsanitary or not according to the usual pig standards, you'll just have to check them for the usual foot and mouth disease and occasional tick. Even if you don't get a full American guinea hog, the guinea's stronger genes will overpower whatever else they were crossed with in the past. Their grazing isn't all that complicated. If you're keeping a guinea of permanent pasture, you'll need 2 acres per pig, and if it's rotational, keeping a dozen on 2 acres won't overtax them at all. These are going to be the closest thing to a multi-purpose pork that you can find for the least amount of upkeep, especially for the homestead, where it's not about how much you can push onto the market in the least amount of time, but instead, it's about the efficiency of labor, lowest amount of cost, and the best overall health of the animal. So far, the Idaho pasture pig and the kune have been our 2 favorite homestead pigs that we've covered on this channel, but honestly, the little guineas have an edge over their foraging cousins. The Idahos need supplementation, and they come with a little more care, and the kune don't have the lard, and they're just a little undersized, making them lean ever so slightly to hobby farming instead of sustainability. This plucky hog is the #1 small-holding pig. He'll feed you, supply you with all the lard you need, and it'll do it all by taking care of itself as much as a pig possibly could. If you can't handle a guinea hog, then don't bother getting pigs at all. There really is no easier, more hardy, or cheaper option in the world than them. The American guinea hog is here for its people, bred in the US for the US. It came into this world completely by accident, and this little survivor has always been so valuable that even the commercial demands of the industrial era didn't phase its popularity all that much. If you're looking for a pig to ease you into keeping hogs, try the guinea hog first. You'll probably end up liking them so much that you won't want to move on to another breed anyway. What's your experience been? Were they as easy and cheap as pasture livestock, or were you one of the very few who had problems with the breed? Please let us know in the comments below. You know how much we love hearing from our viewers. There's no feedback that we look forward to more. Like, subscribe, and have a look at some of our other videos on your screen right now. See you next time.